Section 10 of the Cambridge History of English Literature, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sonia. The Cambridge History of English Literature, Volume 1. From the Beginnings to the Cycles of Romance. Latin Writings in England to the Time of Alfred. Part 1. By Montague Rhodes James. It is outside the scope of this work to survey the various scattered documents of British origin which were produced outside Britain. Moreover, the influence of most of them upon the mainstream of English literature was, beyond all doubt, extremely slight. Among the writings thus excluded from consideration may be mentioned the remains of Pelagius, who seems to have been actually the earliest British author, the short tract of Fastidius, a British bishop, on the Christian life, and the two wonderful books of St. Patrick, the Confession and the Letter to Coroticus, which, in spite of their barbaric style, whereof the author was fully conscious, are among the most living and attractive monuments of ancient Christianity. Outside our province also falls the earliest piece of Latin verse produced in these islands, the Hymn of St. Sachnal, and also the hymns of the Bangor Antiphonary, the writings of Columban, and the lives and remains of the Irish missionaries abroad. All these are named here principally, lest it should be supposed that they have been forgotten. We pass to our earliest indigenous literary products, and the list of these is headed by two somewhat uncouth fragments, marked off from almost all that follow them by the fact that they are British and not English in origin. These are the Book of Gildas and the History of the Britons. Concerning the career of Gildas the Wise, we are told much in the lives of him by a monk of Rhuys and by Caradoc of Llancarvan, which belong respectively to the early part of the 11th century and to the 12th, but almost all the data that can be regarded as trustworthy are derived from Gildas's own book and from brief notices in Irish and Welsh annals. As examined by Zimmer and Theodor Mommsen, these sources tell us that Gildas, born about the year 500 A.D., was living in the west of England, and wrote the book which we possess shortly before 547, that perhaps he journeyed to Rome, that he spent the last years of his life in Brittany, and probably died there in 570, and that not long before his death, probably also in his younger days, he visited Ireland. He is represented by various authorities as having been a pupil of St. Illtyd at Llantwit Major in Wales, together with other great saints of the time. The book of his which remains to us is thus entitled by its most recent editor Mommsen, Of Gildas the Wise, concerning the destruction and conquest of Britain, and his lamentable castigation uttered against the kings, princes, and priests thereof. The manuscripts differ widely in the names they assign to it. The author himself in his opening words describes his work as an epistle. For 10 years it has been in his mind, he says, to deliver his testimony about the wickedness and corruption of the British state and church, but he has, though with difficulty, kept silence. Now he must prove himself worthy of the charge laid upon him as a leading teacher, and speak. But first he will, with God's help, set forth shortly some facts about the character of the country and the fortunes of its people. Here follows that sketch of the history of Britain which, largely used by Bede, and by the compilers of the history of the Britons, is almost our only literary authority for the period. In compiling it, Gildas says he has not used native sources, which, if they ever existed, had perished, but narratives from beyond the sea. What this precisely means it is not easy to determine. The only historical authors whose influence can be directly traced in his text are Rufinus's version of Eusebius, Jerome's Chronicle, and Orosius, and none of these records the local occurrences which Gildas relates. Moreover, the story, as he tells it, clearly appears to be derived from oral traditions, in some cases demonstrably incorrect, rather than copied from any older written sources. It may be that Gildas drew his knowledge from aged British monks who had settled in Ireland or Brittany. It may be that by the relatio transmarina he merely means the foreign historians just mentioned. Brief and rather vague as it is, the narrative may be accepted as representing truly enough the course of events. It occupies rather more than a quarter of the whole work, and brings us down to the time 44 years after the British victory of Mount Badon, when the descendants of the hero of that field, Ambrosius Aurelianus, had departed from the virtues of their great ancestor, and when, in the view of our author, the moral and spiritual state of the whole British dominion had sunk to the lowest level of degradation. In the pages that follow, he attacks, successively and by name, 5 of the princes of the West: Constantine of Devon and Cornwall, Aurelius Caninus, whose sphere of influence is unknown, Vortiper of Pembrokeshire, Cuneglaces, king of an unnamed territory, and the Dragon of the Isle, Maglucunus, who is known to have reigned over Anglesey and to have died in the year 547. Each of these is savagely reproached with his crimes, sacrilege, perjury, adultery, and murder, and each is, in milder terms, entreated to return to the ways of peace. Up to this point the epistle is of great interest, though tantalizing from its lack of precise detail. It now becomes far less readable. The whole of the remainder is, practically, a cento of biblical quotations, gathering together the woes pronounced in Scripture against evil princes and evil priests, and the exhortations found therein for their amendment. The picture which the author draws of the principate and of the clergy is almost without relief in its blackness. He does just allow that there are a few good priests, but corruption, worldliness, and vice are rampant among the majority. That Gildas was convinced of the urgency of his message there is no room to doubt. Like Elijah at Horeb, he feels that he is left alone, a prophet of the Lord, and every word he writes comes from his heart. Yet if we are certain of his sincerity, we are at least equally confident that his picture must be too darkly colored. We have complained that he lacks precision. It must be added that he loves adjectives, and adjectives in the superlative degree. Doubtless Salonius and Sagittarius, the wicked bishops of Gap and Embrun, of whom Gregory of Tours has so much to say, had their counterparts in Britain. But there were also St. Illtyd, St. David, and many another renowned founders of schools and teachers of the young, whose labours cannot have been wholly fruitless. In style, Gildas is vigorous to the point of turgidity. His breathless periods are often wearisome, and his epithets multitudinous. Perhaps the most pleasant sample of his writings is the paragraph in which he enumerates with an ardent and real affection the beauties of Britain. In a few instances he shows that tendency to adorn his page with rare and difficult words which seems to have had a great attraction for the Celtic mind. It is evident that he considers himself a Roman citizen in some sense. To him Latin is our tongue, as opposed to English, and the impression given by this phrase is confirmed by the whole tenor of his writing. His sources of inspiration, as we have in part seen, are Roman. To those already mentioned we may add the names of Virgil, and perhaps Juvenal and Claudian. In summing up the impression which he leaves upon us, we may say that his eyes are fixed regretfully upon a great past. There is no hint of hope for the future. The thought that the heathen English might become a source of light to the Western world is one that has never dawned upon him. In short, Gildas is a dark and sad figure. Night is falling round him. All that he has been taught to prize is gone from him or going, and when he looks upon his land, behold darkness and sorrow, and the light is darkened in the heavens thereof. The literary history of the book is not very complicated. The compilers of the history of the Britons used it, and so did Bede and the authors of the lives of Gildas and of other Breton saints. In the 12th century it was a rare book in England, as William of Newburgh tells us, but Geoffrey of Monmouth had it before him in the first half of that century. We have, besides the epistle par excellence, relics of other epistles of Gildas, in which his peculiar style is very recognizable, and also some penitential canons. Of these latter we need only say that the precise extent of the material in them which can be certainly assigned to Gildas is still in dispute. Another fragment of Gildan literature, upon whose authenticity a curious literary question depends, is the hymn called Lorica or Quiras. This is a metrical prayer in which the suppliant asks for divine protection against the mortality of this year and against evil demons, and enumerates each limb and organ of his body. The form which the prayer takes, though not common, is not unique. A similar hymn in Irish is attributed to St. Patrick, and there are others of Irish origin. The attribution of this particular Lorica to Gildas Gilles, the name in the manuscript, is pretty clearly meant for Gildas, is not unanimous. One Lathacan, Leitken, or Loading, probably an Irish prince of the 7th century, is named by several copies, once as having brought the hymn to Ireland. Zimmer is confident in maintaining that Gildas is the author. Mommsen dissents from this view. It may seem an indifferent matter whether this particular hymn is a work of the 6th or 7th century, but the fact is that its style and vocabulary are of considerable interest as throwing light on the culture of its time, and they connect it with a longer document or group of documents, the date and provenance of which it would be very interesting to settle. In its latter portion, where it enumerates the various parts of the body, Lorica is, to a large extent, a collection of the most obscure foreign and archaic words which the author could scrape together. Hebrew, Greek, and Latin are mingled in the most curious way, and are so disguised and corrupted that, in many cases, we are only able to divine their meaning by the help of glosses. It may be allowable to quote a single line: Gigram cephalem cumiaris et conas, which is said to mean head, head with hair and eyes. The other group of writings in which a similarly extraordinary vocabulary occurs is represented principally by the work called Hisperica Famina, which we possess in more than one text. It is arranged in a series of sections, numbering in all somewhat over 600 lines, of a kind of assonant non-metrical structure. Each line usually consists of 2 parts. The first part contains 1 or 2 epithets, and the verb and subject are in the second part. Each section contains a description of some scene or object: the day's work, the sea, fire, the wind, a chapel, an encounter with robbers. The writer is evidently a member of something like a monastic school, and all that we can certainly say of his surroundings is that he is brought into contact with Irish people, for they are distinctly mentioned in the text. It is impossible to give any idea of the obscurity of Hisperica Famina without quoting or translating passages, and nothing short of the genius of Sir Thomas Urquhart could find equivalents for the amazing words used by the writer. This one point is evident, that the same school produced Lorica and Hisperica Famina. Was that school located in England or Ireland? If Gildas be author of Lorica, it follows, in all probability, that the author of Hisperica Famina was a man brought up, like Gildas, in a South Welsh school, such as that of St. Illtyd, and subsequently settled in Ireland, where he wrote Hisperica Famina. In this case we must place him in the 6th century. One piece of evidence which points in this direction can hardly be set aside. The hymn attributed to St. Columba, and known as Altus Prosator, contains very marked specimens of the Hisperic Latinity. That this composition is really of Columba's age is the belief of its latest editors, and, if that be granted, there is no need to seek for further proof that Hisperica Famina could have been produced in the 6th century, and that, whether Irish in origin or not, its peculiarities were adopted by genuinely Irish authors. The Historia Britonum has been the centre of many controversies as to its date and origin. As set forth in Theodor Mommsen's edition, it consists of the following tracts, which together form what has been called Volumen Britanniae, or the Book of Britain. 1. A calculation of epochs of the world's history brought down to various dates by various scribes or editors. 2. The history of the Britons down to a time immediately after the death of Vortigern. 3. A short life of St. Patrick. 4. A chapter about Arthur. Footnote: see the chapter on the early history of the Arthurian legend in the present volume. End of footnote. 5. Genealogies of Saxon kings and a calculation of epochs. 6. A list of cities of Britain. 7. A tract on the wonders of Britain. As to the probable date of this curious congeries of writings, it is held that they were compiled by a Briton somewhere about the year 679, after which additions were made to them. In particular, about the year 800, a recension of the whole was made by one Nennius. He represents himself as a pupil of Albodugus, who is known to have been Bishop of Bangor, and to have died in 809, and also seemingly as a pupil of one Bulan, for whose son Samuel he made his revision of the book. He may very possibly be identical with the Nemnivus, of whom we have some curious relics preserved in a Bodleian manuscript. The revision of Nennius is not extant in a complete form. Our best authority for it is an Irish version made in the 11th century by Gilla Comgin. Some of the Latin copies have preserved extracts from the original, among which are the preface of Nennius and some verses by him. A principal point to be remembered in this connection is that it is scarcely correct to speak of the history of the Britons as being the work of Nennius. Footnote: the view here expressed is in the main that of Zimmer and Mommsen. It must be mentioned that another hypothesis regards Nennius as primarily responsible for the whole compilation. If this be accepted, there can be no possibility of Bede's having used the book. End of footnote. The sources employed by the original compiler or compilers of the various tracts which make up the volume of Britain are both native and foreign. He or they have drawn largely upon Celtic legend, written or oral. Other writings which have been used to a considerable extent are Gildas, Jerome's Chronicle, and the lost life of St. Germanus of Auxerre. Slighter traces of a knowledge of Virgil, Caesar, Isidore, and a map resembling the Peutinger table are forthcoming. Of the authors to whom the book was known in early times, it is only necessary to name two. In all probability, Bede was acquainted with it, though he does not mention it as having been one of his sources of information. Geoffrey of Monmouth made fairly extensive use of it. The copy which he had evidently attributed the authorship to Gildas, as do 3 at least of our extant manuscripts. It is hardly possible to speak of the history as possessing a distinctive style. Where the author attempts a detailed narrative, his manner reminds us of the historical portions of the Old Testament. The books of Chronicles, with their mixture of genealogy and story, afford a near and familiar parallel. If we possessed the whole of the revision by Nennius in its Latin form, we should most likely find that he had infused into it something of the learned manner beloved of his race and age. At least his preface and his verses indicate this. Greek and Hebrew words occur in the verses, and one set of them is so written that the initials of the words form an alphabet. The original author of the history had no such graces. His best passage is the well-known tale of Vortigern. Within a generation after the death of Gildas, the Roman mission came to Kent, and the learning of the Latins, secular as well as sacred, was brought within reach of the English. The 7th century saw them making copious use of this enormous gift, and Latin literature flourished in its new and fertile soil. Probably the coming of Archbishop Theodore and Abbot Hadrian to Canterbury in the year 668 was the event which contributed more than any other to the progress of education in England. The personalities of these two men, both versed in Greek as well as in Latin learning, determined, at least at first, the quality and complexion of the literary output of the country. But theirs was not the only strong influence at work. In the first place, the fashion of resorting to Ireland for instruction was very prevalent among English students. In the second place, the intercourse between England and Rome was incessant. Especially was this the case in the monasteries of the north. To take a single famous instance, 5 times did Benedict Bishop, abbot of Wearmouth, journey from Britain to Rome, and on each occasion he returned laden with books and artistic treasures. A less familiar example may also be cited. Cuthwin, bishop of the East Angles about 750, brought with him from Rome a life of St. Paul, full of pictures, and an illustrated copy of Sedulius, now at Antwerp, in the Plantin Museum, has been shown to have belonged to the same owner. 4 books which have been preserved to our times may be cited as tangible monuments of the various influences which were being exercised upon the English in the 7th century. The Gregorian Gospels, at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, manuscript 286, written in the 7th century, and illustrated with pictures which, if not painted in Italy, go back to Italian originals, represent the influence of Augustine. The Greco-Latin copy of the Acts of the Apostles at Oxford, Laud, Greek 35, may well have been brought to this country by Theodore or Hadrian. The Lindisfarne Gospels show the blend of Celtic with Anglian art, and contain indications of a Neapolitan archetype. The Codex Amiatinus of the Latin Bible, now at Florence, written at Wearmouth or Jarrow, and destined as a present for the Pope, shows England acknowledging her debt to Rome. End of section 10.